Hey artists! Today we're going to be learning how to paint some realistic wolf fur. Wolf fur is always fun to paint. There's always a nice subtle range of colors, and because the fur tends to be pretty thick, it forms some really great shapes when it comes to the way the hairs sort of clump together. I find that really fun, it's always pretty, so yeah, we're going to learn how to paint some wolf fur. Now, I personally use oil paints these days to create my artwork, so that's what you're going to see me using here. However, I used to work exclusively with acrylics and still manage to paint realistic fur and wildlife, so I know you can too. I'm a little bit of a minimalist when it comes to my art supplies, and that's kind of what I like to teach too. You don't need to have a crazy huge collection of paint colors to start painting realistic wildlife. In fact, you only need a couple. So for this wolf fur, I am going to be using ivory black, titanium white, burnt umber, burnt sienna, and a little bit of yellow ochre. The other supplies I'm going to be using is my favorite glazing medium of all time for oil paint, Liquin Original by the brand Windsor and Newton, and an assortment of filbert and small round brushes for detail, and paint thinner. Now when it comes to brushes, you don't need anything special. You don't need to spend an arm and a leg on brushes. Inexpensive brushes are great for learning, and they're still great for using as a professional artist. They, can be super great, and it's more about your technique anyways. Now, like I mentioned, I'm using oil paint. However, you can definitely achieve the same look with acrylics as well. But because this tutorial uses blending techniques, I highly recommend using a medium with your acrylics that slows down that drying time so that you can actually blend your paint before it dries. We'll talk more about that as we move through this painting. So for this piece, I'm painting on a piece of primed canvas that I've taped to a board so it doesn't move around. And plus I get that super satisfying tape pull at the end that reveals those super crisp edges. And like always, links to all my favorite art supplies are in the description of this video. This tutorial is brought to you by the Wildlife Painting Academy. You can learn more about it in the description of this video. So most of the time, I like to start by mapping my paintings out. If I'm doing a full portrait, usually I'll transfer my completed sketch onto my canvas. But for this demo, since it's only a small section of wolf fur, a couple rough lines with a pencil on my canvas are going to be more than enough. Not going for any detail here. We're just mapping out the general shapes and where those main chunks of fur are going to go. And then we are going to jump in with the paint. I always like to start with my darkest paint first. This allows me to build a really good map for the piece, and it also keeps me from having contrast issues later. Starting with dark makes having stronger values so much easier. So now I'm using dark paint to block in some of those major shadows and markings, and then I'm going to start moving into the lighter paint. Alright, now it's time to start using some lighter paint. This taupey brown is a mixture of burnt umber and titanium white at varying strengths as I go along. And then we're going to add some nice color variation later. In this underpainting phase, I'm not really paying too much attention to detail yet. Block things in before you jump into details. So one of my favorite things to do when painting animals and wildlife is to first focus on values. So the relationship between lights and darks in your art, and build a solid foundation before you worry about color. By using glazes at the end, don't worry, we'll see all that beautiful magic, you get to add all sorts of color without covering up your hard work underneath. It kind of feels like magic, and especially when you do a time lapse of the piece, it looks like magic too. So that's definitely what we're going to be doing here. So now we have the bulk of our underpainting in place. Nice range of lights and darks, and lots of rough brush strokes. If we squint really hard, it might kind of look like fur, but we're going to make things look a lot better. Now it's time to dry blend those rough brush strokes together. I love this technique for fur because it allows you to lay down all your tones first, without worrying about detail or even really the fact that it's fur. Then by grabbing a dry brush, you can blend things together. I love using a soft but sort of beat up brush for this one. One with bristles that are a little messed up, a little war torn. The individual bristles are going to drag in that paint and actually build up a really nice, beautiful soft fur texture for us. And then we can go in and detail it, cherry picking where we want the most detailed to be. Now go in with that brush and lightly blend out your brush strokes. Always want to make sure you're stroking in the direction that the fur grows in. Light touch, be gentle, and when you have too much wet paint on your brush, wipe it off on a rag instead of dipping it in paint thinner, or if you're working with acrylics, dipping it in water. So this is where it's important to mention the use of a slow drying medium if you're following along with acrylics. You can't blend dried acrylic paint, simple as that. But a slow drying medium will definitely give you some extra time to blend those strokes out. You might also have to work in smaller sections too, blending as you go rather than getting your entire underpainting down before blending, but you can definitely make this work with acrylics with just a few small tweaks. So now that your fur has been blended, it's time to let it dry completely before moving on to that detail phase. This can take a few days to a few weeks for oils, or if you're working with acrylics, you can get this painting done a lot more quickly. So now that our painting is dry, we can start detailing. Since we've got a lot of tones that are already pre-mixed on our palette, it makes adding detail pretty easy. I like to use some small round brushes to build in those hairs, making sure to keep a close eye on your reference photo. And then once you are content with your level of detail, it's time to let that baby dry again. This is important. Let me repeat that. We need to let our painting dry at this phase. Our next step is going to be adding that beautiful magic glaze that's going to transform it. But if you add glaze over a wet painting, you're going to have a very bad time. So give yourself a little extra patience and let your painting dry completely before glazing. All right, now it's time for the magic of glazes. I'm going to be adding a bit of Liquin Original by the brand Windsor and Newton to my palette, and then I'm going to pre-mix my chosen glazes. So I'm going with two main glazes here, one for color and one for shadow and shaping. I want this wolf fur to have some nice warmth to it, so I'm adding a bit of burnt sienna to my glaze and mixing it through completely. Easily one of my favorite and most used colors for glazing. It is so pretty. And the other glaze is going to be my shadow glaze, mix of burnt umber and ivory black. I'm going to use this to reinforce my cast shadows and also carve out some of that fur structure. Grab a large brush and start glazing. You can see how much of a difference these subtle washes of paint can change the entire painting. I absolutely love glazing. Now, if you want the color addition to be even more dramatic, then let that glaze layer dry and then add another. The final step of our painting is to add any of those final details. I like to add these to my wet glaze layer because it creates a bit more of a natural look, but if you really want sharp details or highlights, then you might want to let that glaze layer dry before adding those details. If you want to start learning how to paint realistic wildlife easily, then I think you would love the Wildlife Painting Academy. Get access to on-demand, full-length painting masterclasses, so you can learn how to paint a huge range of animals with my voice and instructions walking you through every moment. You can learn more in the description of this video. Well, that brings us to the end of this tutorial. Hopefully you learned how to paint beautiful, realistic wolf fur, and now feel confident that you can create it in your own paintings. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Stay magical, my friend.